I did not lay the lawsuit against Monsanto. Monsanto laid the lawsuit against me. They're the ones that came after me because I was a seed developer, and they wanted to take my rights away to develop seeds and plants. So the issues before the Supreme Court are very broad in nature. It's not only simple in patent infringement, but now it's the whole issue of, by putting a patent on a gene, does that, and you insert it into a seed that has maybe 30,000 other genes or any other life form, does that give you total ownership and control of whatever higher life form you put it into?
In the late 1970s, new genetic methods enabled geneticists to isolate DNA from virtually any organism they wanted, to attach those pieces of DNA to DNA from any other species they wanted. They were called joint molecules or recombinant DNA. You could make combinations of DNA that never occur in nature, and then transfer those recombinant or joint molecules into other species or living organisms. Those organisms were called transgenic organisms.
Genetically modified food refers to a whole heap of different kinds of modification. Any kind of genetic manipulation would fall under the definition of genetically modified. Biodiversity as we see it today is in good part a result of genetic modification. Genetic engineering refers specifically to the crossing of genes between two different species.
Throughout evolution, the very definition of a species was a group of organisms that were not able to exchange DNA with others that were closely related to them. That's the very definition of a species.
Whenever you'll hear, GE or GM, know that, though they use these words interchangeably, know that for the purpose of the debate, we're all referring to the crossing of genes between two species, something that has never been done before.
Now, when you take a gene and introduce it into a crop to which it does not belong, and to which it could never be related through normal breeding, you have created a crop, a seed, a plant, a food that is different from the one without that gene. At the genetic level, this is different.
So when you take a gene out of a flounder and stick it into a tomato plant, you have changed the genomic context within which that flounder gene finds itself. If you took Bono out of U2 and stuck them into the Toronto Symphony and said, make music, noise would come out of that, but there is no way that you can anticipate the consequences.
Our agencies use what is called substantial equivalence.
They just assume substantial equivalence and say, treat it as the same. Treat it as the same as the parent. And do not look, therefore, for any impact of the introduction.
They don't consider it any different than conventional food, and therefore they have not conducted the necessary testing to ensure that they're safe.
We don't know the long-term effects of these transgenic manipulations.
This is a brand new technology. We've never done this before. Yet we're feeding it to our children on a daily basis, not knowing what will come in the future.
By and large, many citizens are in a bit of a vacuum in terms of what is happening with the safety and quality of our foods.
10 years ago, there were no commercial genetically engineered foods for sale on our shelves. Today, almost 70% of grocery products are genetically modified.
Transformation of our food supply was done without our consent or knowledge.
The issue of biotechnology and food has not been transparent.
The government and the industry has gone through tremendous length to prevent us from being able to distinguish between foods containing genetically engineered ingredients and those who don't.
The possibility of democracy depends on a citizenship that knows there are choices to be made and then gets to make them.
And the polls have been consistent for the past 4 years. Over 90% of Canadians say we want mandatory labeling.
If an industry is so proud of its technology, it should be ferociously willing to have its food product labeled in the supermarket so it can brag about it.
So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the food industry knows full well that the minute we have the opportunity to pick the product that doesn't contain genetically engineered ingredients, it's exactly what we're going to do. And so while there's been such a public outcry for a mandatory labeling policy, the industry has been lobbying the government very strongly to not allow that.
Biotechnology is moving at breakneck speed all around the world, escaping jurisdictions in country after country without any legal or ethical framework.
Any epidemiologist worth his salt will tell you that you need labels. You need to have two sample populations to compare. Sample A that eats GE foods and sample B that doesn't, so you compare the two so you could see, whether or not there's an impact here. Without labels, that's impossible to do. We actually believe that that's the reason why they don't want labels. That way you avoid liability.
In Washington, D.C., there is more rigorous regulation of toys by far than biotechnology.
You have a huge new technology and insertion into your food system, and consumers are not supposed to be able to know what it is and still choose. I mean, there's just a huge gap there between what are consumer rights, citizen rights, and the corporate interest in covering this up.
With genetic engineering and the ability to slightly modify a plant or an animal, these companies are now claiming that these newly modified organism or engineered organism are inventions and are claiming patents on them.
What is a patent, anyway? Well, it's a proprietary right that has been in the law for a couple of hundred years. And one of the most important things to know about it is that it was actually devised as a public benefit. So the fundamental purpose of the patent system is a social purpose, and it's a social contract. An inventor gets the exclusive right of an invention for a certain length of time in response, in exchange for disclosing how it's made.
Patents were established for non-life processes.
But extending patents to life forms is something that only started to happen, of course, south of the border in 1980, when the first patent was given on a bacteria, the famous Chakrabarty case, single cell. And after that, without any particular public debate, without really any scrutiny or knowledge in Canada, the Canadian Patent Office decided to give patents on single cell life forms.
Canada is quite the important example because we are one of the only country in the G7 to not have any kind of language in our patent law that speaks to biotechnology. And so because they're in absence of regulatory framework, these companies have gone through a court system. We are talking about companies who have the resources to do just that, leaving the people to do their best to fight them in the courts. A lot of Canadians have reacted to the story of Percy Schmeiser, which perfectly illustrates the problem.
For 6 years now, 73-year-old Saskatchewan farmer Percy Schmeiser has devoted his life to battling agrochemical giant Monsanto. Back in August of 1998, Monsanto filed a lawsuit against Mr. Schmeiser. Somehow, some of their genetically engineered canola seeds ended up on his fields and grew. For a long time, both sides vehemently disputed how the seeds got there in the first place. But in the end, it didn't matter. Monsanto claimed Percy Schmeiser still violated patent laws, and 2 lower courts agreed. Mr. Schmeiser was forced to turn over his entire crop and the seeds he and his wife spent 50 years cultivating. He also had to pay Monsanto's legal bills. His supporters say he is just one more small farmer being strong-armed by the international corporation. They say this case will determine to what extent farmers will have control over their land, crops, and seeds. Tomorrow the Supreme Court decides. Today, Percy Schmeiser joins me in our Saskatoon studio. Good morning.
Come gather round, you people, the story I will tell of farmer Percy Schmeiser, whom tragedy befell. Now he's standing for all farmers against corporate greed. He's fighting for the right to save our seed and for the rights of all farmers to grow their own seed and plant for the future safe food that we all need. Percy Schmeiser, on him you can depend, to stand up to Monsanto till the end. Farming in Saskatchewan for over 50 years.
Percy and Louise Schmeiser. What have they done that has brought them in the time what should have been golden retirement before the Supreme Court of Canada?
Now it's at a court where it should have been many years ago.
They're here because they didn't cave in when Monsanto came and threatened them like they threaten every other farmer.
We just stood up to what we believed in at that time, that farmers' rights should not be taken away, but farmers should always be able to use their own seed.
Some farmers, and Schmeiser is one of them, are seed savers. Now these people are anathema to companies like Monsanto because that means they don't have to come back and buy the seed. They can just keep their own seed, which is what most of the rest of the world does.
And anyone that is a seed developer will tell you that you're developing a form of life, and it becomes just like a part of your family. It's almost like a child, because you've developed something that you've spent so much time with.
But this really is the beginning of the problem that Mr. Schmeiser is experienced. So if he has a contamination event, and there are so many ways that that can happen, then the trait then is in his seed from that point on.
As a canola seed developer, I lost all my research and development. I shouldn't say I, my wife and I have 50 years of research and development because our pure seeds were contaminated by GMOs.
The appeals court acknowledged, and Monsanto acknowledged, that Percy Schmeiser had not stolen or otherwise fraudulently acquired the seed.
Where did the seed originally come from? It came from farmers, from all over the world. They never developed any seed or plant, and by putting a single gene in, they claimed total ownership. Yet a single seed or a plant can have thousands of genes in. By putting one gene in, they claim total ownership. It's the greatest theft or fraud I have ever witnessed in my life.
All it has to be is there, on your land, and you are still guilty if the original judge's decision in this case is allowed to stand. It's just a simply extraordinary situation. And it very clearly illustrates that existing patent law is inappropriate for crops that are genetically modified, particularly when the GM trait, any trait, cannot be contained.
I think it's a very important moment in history. I think we're at a crossroads. There's so many issues like the food, the environment, property rights, intellectual property rights, but most of all, the most important thing to me is who owns life.
Now Monsanto's corporate motto is hope, food, and health. But all they seem to care about is profit, power, and wealth, intimidating farmers till a culture of fear rips up the social fabric we hold dear. Just like a corporate Goliath, Monsanto swaggers round, but Percy Schmeiser is the one to bring the giant down. He's taken the fight back into court, the highest in the land, so that patents on living things are banned.
Morning, Ian. How you doing?
Not bad. How are you?
I got cold ears.
Yeah. In my philosophy, it's okay for Monsanto to be in the market. They have a right to be there, but so do you. You know, and they can't have that line way into your field. Well, push it back out. You've got to have ownership in your crop, and you've got to have the right to grow your crop the way you want to and do with it what you want.
Well, that's what we're here for.
There you go, buddy.
You know, I think one of the fundamental issues before the court is going to be, and I think we argue one of the fundamental mistakes that the lower courts made was to not distinguish between a patent to a gene or a cell on the one hand and a patent to a plant and a seed on the other. Patent Office of Canada doesn't issue patents to plants and seeds. In the simplest terms, Monsanto doesn't have a patent to a seed. So how can a patent to a gene or a cell be infringed by planting a seed?
Our contention in our factum is this, is that if this is what the claims result in, if it can mean any cell, then what you have done is indirectly claimed protection for a plant. Because to say that you haven't claimed a plant when you've claimed every cell within it is akin to say that you haven't claimed Canada when you've claimed every province, every territory, and every speck of dust within it.
The United States, we have allowed the patenting of seeds and plants, and we're issuing a report in about 2 weeks that show that 90 farmers in the United States have been sued and are currently in court, been sued by Monsanto for these patent infringements. So this is a cautionary tale. If this kind of patenting is allowed, we already have 90 and counting cases. We have over 500 cases where the farmers have been forced to settle out of court.
In the new context, biotechnology and intellectual property rights are global phenomena, and a decision by an appellate court in any developing country is bound to resonate with policy and lawmakers, not only in other countries, but also in international bodies that have important roles to play in making policy decisions about biotechnology, about intellectual property rights, particularly as they affect agriculture and the capacity of farmers to engage in traditional farming practices.
We have 90 hundreds. The average settlement so far has been $150,000. So once Monsanto gets this hold that they're asking the Canadian Supreme Court to give them, the persecution of farmers becomes immediate, it becomes widespread, and it becomes very profitable for the company.
The rough calculation is that there are more than 1.4 billion people on Earth that depend upon their ability to save seed in order to feed themselves and their families.
In the United States, we're very used to Monsanto. They've become the poster child for 50 years for the contamination of our communities and our land. They brought us Agent Orange, they brought us PCBs. So this is a polluter. This is a long-term recidivist polluter, Monsanto. There's something very unusual they're asking the Supreme Court of Canada to do for the first time, in my knowledge, which is they're saying we usually have to pay when we pollute. Now, for the first time, we want to be able to pollute, we want to genetically contaminate people like Percy and have them pay us. Rather, standing all pollution, all environmental law on its head. Instead of the polluter paying, they're saying when we pollute your land, we're going to try and use intellectual property as a ruse to have you pay us for our contamination, for our irresponsibility, for our failure to control our genetic contamination.
Where are you going to be as you wait for the Supreme Court of Canada to hand its decision down on Friday?
I will be at my lawyer's office in Saskatoon, and then we plan to hold a news conference at 9:30.
So that's what it's all about, control of the seed supply. The farmers always have to buy their seed. So hopefully tomorrow morning, when we hear the decision from the Supreme Court, the farmers will maintain and continue their rights to use their seed from year to year. It's no longer a Percy Schmeiser case. It's a case now that affects all of society, whether you're a farmer or in any walk of life, because the patenting of genes and inserting them into higher life forms and then climate control has become a big concern for everyone. I'm right now actually at the corner land where Monsanto laid the lawsuit against me, and it was referred to in the lawsuit as field number 2, and the famous number 2 field. These all had pods on last fall, but there's no pods now. So where are they? See, they shell out, they blow, and yet the scientists at my trial said that it can't blow in the wind. Unbelievable, you know. I think that whatever the decision will be tomorrow by the Supreme Court, I'm prepared to accept. But one thing I do know is that I took it as far as I could possibly take it to stand up to the rights of farmers and people around the world, that those rights should not be taken away. So win or lose tomorrow, I've done what all
what I could do, as much as I could do. And I think I have satisfaction in that. I gave it my best.
I haven't read the entire decision. I've only read the head note. I had to go over there and actually pick it up. So we lost 5-4. You can infringe a patent to a lower life form by using, a higher life form.
Did we have, oh wow, we're all on the phone. Oh, and on the phone you have the coalition members, essentially, for the interveners.
Well, hello everybody. It's not the victory that we had hoped for. It is a victory for Percy. He was faced with about a $200,000 judgment on him that was set aside today. And I think that, that makes that's a pretty big difference to us. They had writs of execution registered against his lands and goods and against his farm assets, so those will all go. We came very close on that validity issue, a 5-4 split, almost.
Percy, do you want to say anything?
Well, what I'd like to say is that my wife and I brought it as far as we could. We always wanted it to go to the Supreme Court. And although it was a personal victory for myself, the whole issue of patenting life forms and or a gene and putting it into life forms and then control it, I think now will have to be addressed by the Parliament of Canada.
The bad news is you have to run for Parliament now.
So ends a long and hard-fought legal battle, and we think a well-fought legal battle. We raised 4 grounds of appeal before the Supreme Court of Canada. As it ends, or as it turns out, only one of those grounds of appeal made it across the finish line. But the 4 grounds of appeal were simply that the patent really didn't extend into farmers' fields and would allow a company that patents a gene or a cell to control plants in which they incorporate their gene or cell. The second ground was that since Percy didn't spray his crops with Roundup, he didn't use their patent. The third ground was when you have somebody who comes into possession of patented material, they should at least enjoy the right to continue to save and reuse seed as they've always done. And the fourth ground of appeal was that there was no profit earned in this case because Percy never benefited from the presence of the Roundup Ready gene in his fields. And that is the one that the majority of the court found favor with and set aside the lower court judgment that Percy was to turn over his profits from the crop that he grew in 1998. And also the other thing the court did that's very significant is they said that each party is to bear their own costs. There was approximately $200,000 judgment that was set aside by the Supreme Court of Canada today.
What this issue is fundamentally about is control. When a farmer plants a seed, tied up in that seed, he's planting hope. He's planting hope for his family, for his future, and ultimately for a bountiful harvest. He is not planting Monsanto's patented gene. And unfortunately, this court ruling is allowing seeds to become a tool of oppression now.
Mr. Schmeiser, this has been a long, expensive personal battle over here, long, expensive personal crusade for you. Where do you go from here?
I really believe as of this morning, my battle is over. I brought it as far as I could all the way to the Supreme Court. As I said before, it was a personal victory for me in regards to the awarding of costs. But I believe that in my heart, I'll always be fighting for the rights of farmers, always to be able to use their seed from year to year. So, as I said, the battle ends for me today, but not the battle in my heart.
Biotechnology may in fact be a very important part of the environmental and the health and the food crises that we are going to encounter in the coming years. But believe me, it's far too soon to have any of this stuff in our food stream, in our medical stream, or out in open fields. It's far too soon.
This is a technology that is far ahead of the science that must be its governing discipline. And whenever you have a gap between a technology that has been deployed, in this case millions of acres, and the science that must be discovered and tested, you have trouble. We saw that with nuclear power and radioactive waste. We saw that with motor vehicles and photochemical smog.
You can take a table and start stacking up the peer-reviewed academic, papers that have been published in journals on the health effects of GM crops, and it is a tiny, tiny stack. We might not need 2,000 such reports. We might not even need 1,000, but you'd think with a new technology that each and every one of us was going to eat, you'd need a couple hundred. They don't exist.
We don't have a tradition of critical thinking about technology.
There is a presumption that technological change is progress.
That so much of what is being talked about as an advance actually has nothing to offer us, except hazards and control. It's an advance in control. It's a brilliant advance in control.
Everything is born of a seed. Like people, plants, animals, it's seed. If they can control that, look what they can all control. It's to the point of scary.
Well, I mean, if you just look at what seeds they want control of, it's clearly a lucrative business. We all have to eat.
Seed saving, of course, is a huge obstacle to the private seed industry.
And if you can get control of the major staple crops by owning the seed, you can charge whatever you want.
If you make seed saving a criminal activity, well, that opens up a large market.
I can see this scenario where the farmers will end up with fewer and fewer farmers, and they will be basically growing on contract for the companies.
And we see how it's played out with Percy, and how patents can undermine these traditional practices.
I think that is an absolute case study in how this works. And for every Percy Schmeiser there is out there that's publicly saying, hey, I'm being attacked by Monsanto, there's many, many farm families that have been forced to sign gag order confidentiality agreements, and they're not talking, and they never can talk, and if they talk, they lose the farm.
For them, pollution is not a problem. It's a way of owning farmers' fields, like they did in the case of Percy Schmeiser. You pollute and you own. You've got patents and you've got no responsibility.
I would say that if you go to any canola field now, I don't care where, you'd find GMO in it.
The outcome of the Supreme Court trial was that Schmeiser was guilty of patent infringement on the basis of the gene being there. And yet, the gene is everywhere.
I phoned up a couple of seed companies this spring. If I want to seed canola, I want pure canola seed, and they just laugh at you. They said, there is no such thing.
Some of the work that we did and work that Ag Canada did that showed that canola seed lots were contaminated with transgenes. So what that meant is that a farmer could buy non-GM canola seed, and they had a better than 50% chance of having GM genes in that non-GM canola seed, or having the Roundup Ready gene in that non-Roundup Ready canola.
Where is our purity with registration, certification, pedigree seed stocks now?
It's almost impossible for farmers to avoid it.
The corporation took on the farmer, although the farmer was very courageous in being willing to stand up and risk more by going public.
I might have lost this battle, but the war continues. The war will continue against these corporations.
Just to know the power of that company, Monsanto, and it only took two people to take that stand to rally an entire world behind them.
You cannot fight a battle alone, and I had people helping me from all over the world.
There's internationally a tremendous amount of support for the Percy Schmeiser case. It just speaks to how worried people are about that interface now between the corporate power and small farmers.
From the onset, Percy's battle in Canada has been portrayed as a David versus Goliath story, and it is very much that. But by the time, the hearing was done, what the papers were talking about, was should we or should we now allow the patenting of life forms?
We never believed in our lifetime that life could become commodified.
How did we ever come to the view that it was appropriate to claim ownership of genetic material and life forms and the replication thereof? That's, as my kids would say, really sketchy.
What we need is for constituents to make it very clear to their politicians that this is unacceptable.
Now it's up to the Parliament of Canada, the people of Canada, to decide. We could not do any more than that.
If there's one thing that every politician I've ever met has, it's a great finger to the wind. And so it's our job to give them a lot of wind.
I've been asked, why did you do it? So many times, I was asked that. And I says, I guess if you believe in something and you think you can make a change, you work at it.
There's a price on the wind blowing in on the prairie. There's a price on the wind and the seed that it carries. It's a warm summer wind with a seed in its belly. It's a sly summer wind blowing in for a feed. Treacherous wind, mercenary. But I don't blame the wind for bringing me this bad seed. I don't blame the wind for bringing me this grief. I don't blame the wind for bringing me Monsanto. I just blame the arrogance that thinks that it can own all life. They got a patent on the wind. On the wind, and it don't love for free anymore.
When they call me a hero, it makes me feel, it gives me a funny feeling. I don't want to be a hero. That's the last thing, I've told some people, look, I've had a good life, and society has given me a lot, and I feel, Louise and I feel now we should give something back.